Interesting news about a potential signing for Impact Wrestling, or at least negotiations for a signing that didn't happen in the end for the promotion. That involves MMA legend Chael Sonnen. Yes, Chael Sonnen was reportedly in negotiations with Impact Wrestling to come in for a big feud, because it's being reported that Impact Wrestling tried to land Chael Sonnen for a big feud in the promotion. According to Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer, Sonnen had discussions with Impact Wrestling to come in and feud with none other than the world's most dangerous man, the world's most dangerous Impact Wrestling Hall of Famer, Ken Shamrock. But ultimately, the former UFC fighter decided against coming in to work with the company. Now, according to the report, there isn't a ton of details about what these negotiations had in terms of plans for the feud with Shamrock, a time frame, a timeline, how many appearances he was going to make, if he was going to wrestle a match, if it was just going to be a feud with him being in the corner of someone else. We don't really know the details when it comes to that. All that we know is that negotiations did take place, but ultimately Chael Sonnen decided not to come in and work with Impact Wrestling. Now, as I mentioned, no timetable was given as far as when Sonnen would have entered the company. Shamrock recently has finished his feud with Eddie Edwards. He finished that feud at Bound for Glory. He's also, as I mentioned earlier, an Impact Wrestling Hall of Famer. He was inducted into the Impact Wrestling Hall of Fame that night at Bound for Glory. In recent weeks, he's still been in his partnership with Sami Callihan in Impact Wrestling. And actually, next week on Impact Wrestling, he's going to challenge for the Impact World Championship against current Impact World Champion Rich Swann. So as far as Chael Sonnen goes, he retired from MMA in June of 2019. He lost in a fight at Bellator 222. He does have a background, of course, with pro wrestling. Obviously, a long time pro wrestling fan. Chael Sonnen, I think at one point, even was in negotiations with WWE to come in. This was prior to a UFC fight that he had. I believe, if I'm correct, he had, or at least he tells the story of having negotiations with Vince McMahon, and Vince McMahon said, if you win the fight and you're the champion, or we'll sign you and don't show up for the fight. It was something along those lines, but he has sort of toyed with coming into WWE in the future. I don't think that's going to happen now, considering that, Chael Sonnen isn't what Chael Sonnen was 5 years ago, or longer than that, when he was fighting in the UFC regularly. But he still does have history with pro wrestling, in addition to being a big fan. He was actually part of the planned GFW Global Force Wrestling in 2015 with Jeff Jarrett. He was actually going to be part of the commentary team with GFW, but of course that promotion never got off the ground. In the end, Jeff Jarrett goes back to Impact Wrestling. GFW merges with Impact Wrestling. I think at this point, even in November of 2020, that whole process with Anthem, GFW, Jeff Jarrett, I think is that still ongoing when it comes to the legal issues with GFW, Impact, Anthem, and Jeff Jarrett? I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't really care. But the point being is that Chael Sonnen obviously does have a history of pro wrestling, a fandom when it comes to pro wrestling, and he's legitimate. He's a former MMA fighter. In addition to that, a high-level MMA, UFC fighter. So getting him in for Impact Wrestling, regardless of whatever capacity it would have been in, would have been a massive deal for Impact Wrestling. Now, of course, Chael Sonnen is not the only name that Impact has been talking to recently. There is a report about a WWE Hall of Famer that was scheduled to come in, or at least Impact tried to bring him in for Bound for Glory. We're going to be doing a video about that too, so keep your eyes peeled and subscribe to the channel when we do a deep dive on the discussions about that deal and why that broke down. But regardless of if it happened or not, look, it would have been a huge deal, I think, for Impact Wrestling if they'd managed to get Chael Sonnen in. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, he would have feuded with Ken Shamrock, but who would have known what would have happened? Sometimes it's just the foot in the door mentality, isn't it? If you can bring someone into the company and then guess what? They really like it. They like the atmosphere. They're really happy with the amount of money they're making. Remember Bill Goldberg, when he came back to WWE in 2016, that was going to be for one match at Survivor Series, and he's still showing up today in WWE, regardless of if the fans like it or not. Why? Because the money's good, and he has a good relationship now with Vince McMahon. It could have been the same deal here with Chael Sonnen. Maybe he came in for one appearance, for one match, or one promo, or whatever with Ken Shamrock, and then guess what? He goes, you know what? The money's good. I like the atmosphere here. I like working with Ken Shamrock. I'm still a fan of pro wrestling. Maybe we can make this work. So it would have been a big deal. It would have been a massive deal. And as far as I'm aware, now you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think Chael Sonnen has ever wrestled a pro wrestling match for a company. I might be massively wrong there, but I don't think off the top of my head that he has. If he hasn't, getting him in, Impact Wrestling, bringing in Chael Sonnen and actually having him work a match against Ken Shamrock in addition to that would have been massive. Can you imagine saying Chael Sonnen, decorated MMA fighter, fought at the highest level for a while, obviously had his controversies as well, which in the world of pro wrestling isn't a bad thing. If you can get a guy in that everyone knows, people will talk about, good or bad, it works especially for a promotion like Impact because it gets people talking about Impact Wrestling again. And Chael Sonnen is just that. He's a lightning rod. He always has been a lightning rod in the world of MMA and sports for that matter. Very outspoken, very loud, doesn't mind sharing his opinion, doesn't mind getting into a controversial situation or circumstance. And that would have been perfect for Impact Wrestling. It really would have been perfect for Impact Wrestling. So in addition to that, you can also have Impact say, Chael Sonnen's making his pro wrestling debut with Impact Wrestling. How big would that have been for the company? That would have got a ton of attention. In a year that Impact has continued to get lots of attention for a variety of reasons. Most of them have been good, a couple of bad ones in there as well, but none of us are perfect. So that would have been massive as well. And from my point of view, as a fan, as someone that covers pro wrestling, as someone that's watched pro wrestling and watched Impact for over 20 years at this point, I would have been interested. I would have been very, very interested to see what Chael Sonnen brought in, what Impact could do with him. Because, he's obviously not the young Chael Sonnen that he was. Is he the draw that he once was? Maybe not. At the peak of his popularity and notoriety in his UFC days, is he that now? Probably not. But I would have been fascinated to see what can Chael Sonnen offer. Because, like I said, he's a pro wrestling fan. And it would have been interesting to see what he would have been willing to do in the ring, on the mic, and just let him loose and to have something different. We haven't seen Chael Sonnen really in that space before, on a big stage, in a relatively major company. And I would have been fascinated to see it. I would have been fascinated to see two former MMA guys go at it, two former MMA legends, see how they would have incorporated that into the feud. Would they have had a traditional wrestling match, or would they have had a sort of, back in the day in the WWE Attitude Era, you had Ken Shamrock, you had the Lion's Den match. Now, I'm not saying that Impact would have done the same thing there, but I would have been interested to see if they would have done something like that. Would it have even been a one-on-one match? Would you have had a tag team match? Of course, Ken Shamrock is teaming a lot with Sami Callihan after being rivals with him for ages as well. So there would have been such a wide spectrum of things they could have done with this feud, and I'd have been interested. I'd have been absolutely fascinated to see what they would have done for it. So it's a shame it hasn't paid off, but it does go to show what Impact's perspective is when it comes to Ken Shamrock. I think a lot of people were hesitant when it came to Shamrock because I think people thought, well, he's going into the Impact Hall of Fame. That might spell that maybe he's on his last legs when it comes to his run in Impact Wrestling. But I think, quite frankly, it's the opposite to that. I think Impact Wrestling is doubling down when it comes to Ken Shamrock. They obviously are. The guy's, is he 55 years old? I mean, he's in his mid-50s. Still looks great. Still looks absolutely great. And I'm hesitant almost to say anything bad about him because he could absolutely kill me in about 5 seconds. That's through a computer screen as well, let alone in person. So I have no idea. I wouldn't want to say anything bad about the world's most dangerous man. And I've been very vocal about how I think Impact have used Ken Shamrock really well, actually, during his time with the company. This is always my argument with people when it comes to things like this. They'll say, well, it's not the old Ken Shamrock. Well, of course it isn't. Of course it isn't, because it's not 1999 or it's not 98 or 97. Of course it's not the same Ken Shamrock that it was all of those years ago in the Attitude Era. But it's still Ken Shamrock nevertheless. And he still can go. Is he limited? Absolutely. Anyone of 55 years of age that has gone through, the battles that he has in pro wrestling and MMA, of course, it's not going to be the same Ken Shamrock. But that's how then you start using things. That's how you start using things to benefit the product and to benefit the character. You use Ken Shamrock in a way that you don't expose any of these negative elements, right? You don't expose any of these weaknesses that he has now he's a little bit older. You still portray him in that light of he's a legit badass. Even at his age, he's still choking people out and putting them in ankle locks, and he still looks great. And I think Impact have done that very, very well. The way they've presented Ken Shamrock as a legend of the company and still a legit badass, and not being involved all the time, because now he's sort of the heavy to Sami Callihan and he's not wrestling every week. I think that presentation of Shamrock in Impact Wrestling has been excellent. I think it's been very well done, actually. So you have to give him credit to that. And the fact that Impact's willing to go out to people like Chael Sonnen and say, do you want to come in and face Ken Shamrock, shows that they still see Ken Shamrock as a big draw, a big name, and a name that they can use and leverage to bring in other talents from that MMA world, that legitimate MMA world, and bring it into Impact Wrestling. And I think that's smart. I think that's smart from the perspective of Impact Wrestling. Look, if it wasn't for Ken Shamrock, you wouldn't have The Rock appearing on the Bound for Glory pre-show to induct Ken Shamrock. You just wouldn't. That's the power of having someone like Ken Shamrock. That's the power of having a name like Ken Shamrock. You can, even if they're cameo appearances, you can bring in people like The Rock, people like Bret Hart, who else? Mick Foley appeared in that video. Now, obviously, having The Rock on the pre-show Bound for Glory, even if it's for 5 seconds, isn't going to boost Impact up to a stratosphere level, you know, and be on the same level as WWE or anything like that. But that is content, that is a clip that Impact Wrestling can use over and over and over again, and I'm sure they will use it over and over and over again, and you don't get that if it's not for Ken Shamrock. That's why they have Ken Shamrock there. That's why Ken Shamrock's still featured in. And even though these negotiations and these discussions with Chael Sonnen fell through, that's why you have someone like Ken Shamrock in there, because I don't even think those negotiations would have taken place in the first place if it wasn't for having Ken Shamrock in the company and being like, we've got this idea, MMA guy versus MMA guy, are you interested? So that's why you have Ken Shamrock in the company. That's why you have Ken Shamrock on the roster. Now, I think we've got to play a little bit of hypothetical what if now, because obviously the Chael Sonnen feud with Ken Shamrock didn't happen, and that's a shame, because like I said, I would have been interested in it. But you have to look at the timeline here, which to me is quite confusing, because when would have Chael Sonnen had the match or the fight or the confrontation with Ken Shamrock? I think it's quite interesting. Now, obviously, the fact that these negotiations have happened and fell through, they've obviously happened, I wouldn't say ages ago, but relatively recently. And of course, as I've mentioned, Ken Shamrock was in a feud with Eddie Edwards for Bound for Glory. So would you have had this Shamrock versus Chael Sonnen match at Bound for Glory? I don't know, because going back even to this summer, it was always the plan to have Eddie Edwards versus Ken Shamrock. I remember sharing that report from Fightful back in the summer, saying that in October, this might have been in even July, right after Slammiversary, the plan from July even to all the way to October was to have Ken Shamrock versus Eddie Edwards. So I'm not sure when this match would have happened between Ken Shamrock and Chael Sonnen. What I can speculate on, and I don't know if this is true, this is purely me speculating at this point, but obviously that match for me felt slightly awkward at Bound for Glory, because you had Eddie Edwards versus Ken Shamrock, but then you had Sami Callihan at ringside. Now, I understand that Sami Callihan is part of the Ken Shamrock character now, and Sami Callihan is a bit of a mouthpiece, but he also wrestles too. It did feel a little bit awkward, him just being there at ringside, kind of if it was maybe meant to be a tag match. That's what I'm thinking maybe might have been the plan here, and to me, in my head, that makes the most sense. If you'd have had Eddie Edwards and Chael Sonnen versus Ken Shamrock and Sami Callihan, that to me makes a lot of sense, because Chael Sonnen isn't just going to go in and work a 25-minute hold-for-hold wrestling match. He's not had a match before, I don't think, or even if he has, he's maybe only had one or two. So it's hardly going to be spectacularly fluid in the ring and a fantastic wrestler. Therefore, if you have a tag team match, you don't expose Chael Sonnen that much. So I think, and again, speculation on my part, I haven't seen this anywhere, but trying to read the tea leaves, as it were, here, I think probably you'd have been looking at Eddie Edwards and Chael Sonnen versus Ken Shamrock and Sami Callihan at Bound for Glory. I think that maybe that was the plan. Ultimately, that didn't happen. Now, let's not rule this out completely, though. Because they've had these negotiations once and it didn't happen, that's not to say they can't revisit it. Maybe now this report is out. Maybe now we know that Impact did have negotiations with Chael Sonnen, and maybe they try again. Because if this gets a positive reaction from fans online, if you're watching this video and you go, oh, I really would have wanted to see Ken Shamrock and Chael Sonnen have some form of confrontation in Impact Wrestling. If you start tweeting about it, or if you start writing about it, Impact will hear that, Anthem will hear that, and Chael Sonnen will hear that, and maybe they go for round 2, as it were, when it comes to negotiations. Who knows? So maybe at Slammiversary next year, you could even be looking at that. Now, obviously, that's a long time off, but my point being, when it comes to pro wrestling, you can't rule anything out. You just can't. And I know it's so cliche, and I know it's so boring to hear people say, well, never say never. But you really can't say that. Anything can happen in pro wrestling. If it wasn't planned to have a Bound for Glory match, then I really don't understand the timing, because the timing would sound really odd on this one. I can't imagine Impact would have been negotiating with Chael Sonnen in the last couple of weeks post Bound for Glory, because realistically, what has he got it to come in for? There isn't anything big. The next pay-per-view is Hard to Kill in January, but that's hardly the ginormous pay-per-view here. The 2 big pay-per-views when it comes to Impact are Slammiversary or Bound for Glory. If you're going to bring in Chael Sonnen, you bring him in for Slammiversary or Bound for Glory. You don't bring him in for Hard to Kill. I just don't see that. In terms of Hard to Kill as a pay-per-view, but it's not the biggest pay-per-view. It's certainly not the one that most people are going to be watching. So unless it would have had to have been for Bound for Glory, the timeline or time frame would have had to have been for Bound for Glory. So if it wasn't, the timing would have been really odd on that one. But nevertheless, it would have been a huge deal for Impact to do, and it's a shame they weren't able to pull it off. Chael Sonnen, as I said, is a big name. He is a big name, and he was a pro wrestling character in an MMA world. He's been very open about that. He said that his character, almost, that he portrayed in the UFC and in MMA, that sort of big mouth, big talker, ranter, raver, almost cutting a promo every time he was at a press conference or post-fight, pre-fight. He'd almost cut a promo like The Rock or anything like that. Or he played up to being a sort of a pro wrestling heel in MMA. He got it. He got it. And it would have been really interesting to see him enter, finally, the pro wrestling world as he portrayed it all the time in MMA. And I think it would have been a lot of fun. And I think also what you have to look at as well is bringing in Chael Sonnen. You don't bring in Chael Sonnen for a bit of chump change. You know, Chael Sonnen is a name. He's an MMA guy. He's a former UFC fighter. He's got lots of different irons in the fire right now in terms of different things that he's working on. It would have cost Impact Wrestling a pretty penny to bring in Chael Sonnen. It would have cost a lot of money. I have no doubt about that. I mean, he's very busy. He's got his own podcast. I think he's got his own radio show. He's probably still involved in training when it comes to MMA. He works for ESPN covering the UFC, right? We always see him on those prelims, him up with all these people, you know, going crazy and all this kind of stuff. So Chael Sonnen's a busy guy and he has a good income. So it's not like he needs the money. It's not like he's desperate to make a pro wrestling shot because he needs the cash. So he's a pro wrestling fan. I think that's why Impact would have thought they could have potentially brought him in, and that's why Chael Sonnen initially must have been interested in listening to what Impact had to offer, because he's a fan of pro wrestling, and he has been involved even on a commentary point of view with pro wrestling in the past. As I mentioned, he was an MMA fighter doing a pro wrestling character during his time. So most importantly, if you were to bring him in, you don't have to worry about when you bring in other sports stars or celebrities or anything like that, because he gets it. He's a pro wrestling fan, but he gets it. He gets the showbiz, he gets the promo, he gets the character side of it. He gets it all, and I think it would have been a lot of fun. I really do think that would have been a lot of fun, and I think it would have been a statement of intent. I think it would have been a statement of intent by Impact. Obviously, you would have had some people criticizing it. There's no doubt you would have had people criticizing it. It's two old MMA guys, two retired MMA guys fighting. And if this happens in WWE, which it has in the past, you get a lot of criticism. Why are we watching these two old guys fight? People wouldn't pay money to watch them fight in the UFC, so why would they watch them pay money to fight in the WWE? I get it. People criticize, Cain Velasquez versus Brock Lesnar, which is an upgrade to Ken Shamrock versus Chael Sonnen. But people criticize it nevertheless, and I get that criticism. So I'm not going to be one of those people that says, well, just because it's happening in Impact, I'm going to praise it, and I would be criticizing it in WWE. That is a legitimate argument, and I'm not going to say, oh, it's the most amazing idea Impact ever had, and I'm really disappointed it didn't happen or anything like that. But I think it would have been good for Impact. I've been very consistent with these kind of situations where I never have a problem. I never have a problem with an ex-sports star, a current sports star, a celebrity, a boxer, whoever, coming into the world of pro wrestling because it's good for pro wrestling. And people might disagree with me with that, but it's true. It's always good for pro wrestling. Pro wrestling always benefits. Why? Because it gets more eyeballs on the product. You know, at a time where ratings are down across pro wrestling, you need to do whatever you can to bring eyeballs onto the product, to get people viewing, okay? There'll be legitimate MMA fans, UFC fans, whatever, that would hear, well, Chael Sonnen's fighting in what company? Impact Wrestling? Oh, I'll take a look at that. Or Chael Sonnen, they might even hear the ridiculousness. Chael Sonnen's fighting Ken Shamrock. How old are those guys? They're all washed up, blah, blah, blah. But in that sentence, they'll say who they fighting for, and they'll hear Impact Wrestling. And they might give it a watch. They might give it a watch, or they might buy the pay-per-view or whatever. And if it brings in even a couple of fans that previously weren't watching Impact Wrestling, and they stay around because they see the actual wrestling on the show, they get familiar with other characters on the show, then it's worth it. Then it's absolutely worth it. So I credit Impact for going after a big name, even though they weren't able to pull it off. I mentioned previously about the issues that Impact are having quite frankly, when it comes to talent, because there's a lot of talent going out the door, whether it's contracts expiring, the Rascals, Sami Callihan contract coming up, Ty Valkyrie, Ethan Page, you've got people leaving, whether it's RVD and Katie Forbes earlier on, EC3, you've got injuries as well when it comes to Heath, Kylie Ray left as well, injuries to Alex Shelley as well. They need to bring people in the door. And Chael Sonnen, look, obviously it's not going to happen now, and it was going to cost a lot of money, but I think also it's a statement of intent, even just negotiating with someone like Chael Sonnen, is that Impact is kind of showing their hand a little bit here and saying, you know, we've got some money. We've got some money. We could afford Chael Sonnen if we wanted to. People kind of forget that about Impact because obviously from its heyday on Spike TV and being viewed by, was it 1.5, 1.8 million people every Thursday night, I think people think, well, Impact, obviously they've shrunk. They had those terrible years with the Dixie Carter and the Game of Thrones stuff, and they don't have as much money now, and maybe they have a smaller budget. Maybe that is true. But make no mistakes about it, Impact are very well backed by Anthem. Anthem are pretty flush with cash. Anthem owned the TV station or the TV network that they air on. Impact has its own streaming service. They're fine. They are more than fine when it comes to finances. And I think when it comes to Chael Sonnen, obviously, as I mentioned previously, I think the end goal with him would have been to have a match. Surely it would have been to have a match. So I don't think you just bring in Chael Sonnen to feud with Ken Shamrock and then they appear in other guys' corners. I think eventually the goal would have been to get in the ring and have some form of contact between those two. But whilst you're building up to that, you'd get him on commentary. You could have get him on commentary, and I think Chael Sonnen on commentary every week, that'd have been a real nice addition to the broadcast team right there. And again, not to poo-poo on Madison Rayne or anything like that. I think she does a fine job on commentary. It's just not for me. I just don't really like her work on commentary, but that's preference. It's the same with any soundtrack to any program, whether it's music or commentary or anything like that. That's just preference. It's just opinion. I think she's fantastic, and obviously she's a legend in the Knockouts division. I'm just not too wild on her commentary. If it was me, I'd have Don Callis on commentary every single week because I think he's the best colour guy in the business. I really do, and I've got some criticism for that, but I think he really is that good. Regardless, having a name like Chael Sonnen on commentary as well, doing some colour, he did it for GFW. That would have been a massive addition as well. So whilst he was, I know, training for a match, he could have been a commentator, he could have been a manager, he could have been a mouthpiece, he could have just been a character on the show. Maybe he didn't need to work every single week, and I don't think he would have a million matches, maybe just one, but even if he was just a regular character on the show, even if he just hosted his own talk show in the ring every single week, something like that would have just added something different to the broadcast every week. And I think that would have been very interesting because you have to remember, the Impact Wrestling schedule is not this crazy schedule. It really isn't. Working an Impact schedule, you work maybe like 3 or 4 days a month, which is about 2 TV tapings. They block out all of the episodes of Impact on Access TV, and that's it. So the schedule isn't super intense. He's a very busy man. Like I said, he's got multiple irons in the fire, whether it's podcasting, radio shows, ESPN, UFC, whatever. Maybe he could block out a couple of days to do a couple of Impact shots in a month. Anyway, it's not going to happen. After all that, it's not going to happen, which is a shame because I think just having the star power on Impact every week would have been fascinating to watch. It would have been huge. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, but nevertheless, it would have been fantastic and awesome to see. But it's a sign that Impact are going after some big names. As I mentioned, we will be doing a video on the other name that Impact did reach out for Bound for Glory. So Stay tuned for that one. But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Impact Wrestling negotiating with Chael Sonnen for a feud with Ken Shamrock, but it ultimately fell through? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll be sure to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys and chatting about Impact Wrestling here on the channel. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button. Really does help us out here on YouTube, go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.